So I'm just going to read the letter that I got in the mail, and you'll see why I think it takes its own section. Here it is. Detective Wallace, do you think it's necessary to take the creation count of Genesis literally? In light of other Old Testament books where it said that 1,000 years is like a day to the Lord, that makes me think the 7 days of creation don't need to be taken literally. The intelligent design philosophy seems reasonable, but the young earth belief is a deal breaker for me. I don't want to take much freedom with my interpretations. What do you think is a reasonable view of the creation account? This is a can of worms, right? Because you know that there is a spectrum of belief related to the creation account that kind of divides the church, divides a lot of Christian apologists. This idea that is the earth young, created in 6 literal 24-hour periods? Is the earth old? Maybe these are epic periods of time. Maybe we've misunderstood the idea of a day. A day is 1,000 years to the Lord. Maybe these are 1,000 years. Maybe that's more. Maybe even the expression that a day is like 1,000 years is not to say that it's like literally 1,000 years, but it's a lot longer than we think a day is. Is this one of God's days of creation? Is this one of our days of creation? I get this back and forth all the time. I will tell you that this is so divisive that I'm always a little bit cautious about addressing it at all. And what we're doing here is trying to resolve the 2 ways that we know anything about the universe. One we know by way of observing the world around us naturally. This is natural revelation, and it's described in Romans 1, where Paul says, hey, no one's got an excuse to not believe in God because you've got enough information just in the natural revelation that you're without excuse. You ought to know just from what you can see around you. And the stuff I've described in one of my books called God's Crime Scene really does list the way that there is sufficient evidence in the natural realm to believe that God exists. Of course, the other way to know what there is to know about God in the universe is through the special revelation of His revealed words of God from the mind of God in Scripture. So occasionally, this is one of these questions we're talking about here, there seems to be a rub between what we can know about God from the pages of Scripture and what we can know about God from looking at the world around us. If I look at the world around us and the science seems to tell us that we're in an ancient universe, how do I resolve that with Scripture telling me that I'm in a relatively new universe? Well, first of all, we don't know how old the universe is precisely from Scripture, only because we don't have a heel-to-toe lineage of names from the Old Testament to New. When we look at any genealogy, you know there are names that are missing, and there are names that are slightly different. So we don't know how many generations are missing in our genealogies, but people have tried to go from the creation of Adam and Eve, follow the genealogy all the way down to where we are today, and they get a certain age of the universe. And most times it's going to be 6, 8, 10,000 years old. Well, if you're looking at natural revelation and you don't think that the universe is 6, 8, or 10,000 years old, you're going to have a rub here. Which do I trust? What I see in the natural realm, Romans 1, or what's revealed to me in Scripture? Well, anytime we see there might be an apparent difference in these 2 areas, and I'm not suggesting there is, it's just apparent, we're going to have to do one of 2 things. Reinterpret what we're seeing scientifically based on Scripture, or reinterpret what we think Scripture is telling us based on what we see in natural revelation. I don't think these are necessarily kind of a secular versus Christian view, because the Bible tells us that both of these approaches are uniquely Christian. Paul tells us in Romans 1 that looking at the world to discern certain truths is a Christian process, and looking at Scripture to discern certain truths is also a Christian process. So the question becomes then, how do we resolve these 2 things? And by the way, if you think that the young earth view is correct, then you're going to have to be able to argue for why the science is wrong. If you think the science is correct, you're going to have to be able to argue for what you're misinterpreting in Scripture. Both have got to do something. You either got to figure out what you're misinterpreting in special revelation or what you're misinterpreting in natural revelation. This is the process, right? And Christians have done this through history, and they've landed in a number of different places. I'm only going to mention for you 4 today that are pretty common within the church, okay? This first one, of course, you know, is just literal 6-day young earth creationism. It's this idea that the pages of Scripture, when they describe 6 24-hour days of creation, they are simply meaning a straightforward reading of 6 24-hour days. And that's why these folks are going to end up coming to the conclusion that the universe is relatively young. Another group would argue, well, no, it's actually the days. Maybe I've misinterpreted what is meant by a day. Is it a day in God's economy? Is it a day in our economy? Does it mean, is that word more flexible and allows me to use it in some other way? These are known as day, age, old earth creationists. And this idea is that the word day is open to interpretation in Genesis and therefore might mean a much longer period of time. It might also just mean that it's a day, a segment of day interpreted from God's perspective rather than ours. I mean, I've seen a number of ways that these folks will approach this. And I have been in this spectrum somewhere myself throughout my own life as a Christian. And if I'm sitting with somebody who will take the time to parse out the argument for one or the other, I can totally understand why one side feels strongly about it. What I do see, though, is that if you're on the ancient side or the young earth side, is there's a tendency here to say, well, you're not only wrong, but you're a heretic and you're not saved. And that's where I want to be careful, because it seems to me this has never been a Christian essential. Now, the folks I know who held an ancient view, they're not heretical. They're not saying, I reject what Scripture teaches. They're saying, no, I want to embrace what Scripture teaches. I'm just trying to figure out what the author means in this setting. So it's not that I'm trying to reject what Moses writes. I'm trying to figure out, what does Moses mean? That's a very different process. So these folks are not trying to be heretical or reject the authority of Scripture. And the folks I know who are young earthers are not, they're pretty good at making a case for why the science is wrong on some of these things, or is more open to interpretation than we think it is. So it's not as though the young earthers are ignorant of science and the old earthers are ignorant of the authority of Scripture. They're both doing their best to interpret the revealed, the special revelation of God with the natural revelation of God. Here's another view that is held by some people. It is called gap theory old age creationism. This idea that there's a gap of some period of time, and it's a big period of time typically between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. But the idea here would be that there is this period of time that is unaccounted for in Scripture, and that's where the age of the universe would sit. There's also another view here, which is a more recent view, at least in my understanding of it, and this is what I would call audience-specific literature creationism. And this is the idea that hey, all of you have got it messed up. Moses is not trying to write a chronological history or do origin science. What he's really trying to do is dispel the Jews that he's leading from their errant views of God and cosmology that were based on their captivity in Egypt. The Egyptians held a certain view. The sun is a god, but basically all these objects are their own divine beings. And so what Moses is doing is saying, no, these are all creations of God. And the book, and they would argue, and there's very articulate arguments for this, that all of this is really meant to be a form of literature that dispels bad ideas about God and creation. And so it's never meant to be taken in the literal way that we sometimes take it, and therefore get into these kinds of arguments. Okay, I've just given you four quick views that are held by Christians. And by the way, ancient Christians have been divided on the issue of whether or not it is 24-hour period of time. There were several, for example, that believed that God created instantaneously and did not even get involved in 24-hour periods of time. Augustine believed this. Origen believed this. I think Clement of Alexandria believed this. But again, all these folks came to slightly different conclusions about creation well before we had any science to push them in one direction or the other. So I think we have to at least be fair about that. So let me show you the way I approach it. And here's a way I've kind of always approached it. I try to seek those things that are common first, and then look at the differences. Here's what I know we all hold in common. Take a look at your screen. We all believe, regardless of where you land on interpreting Genesis 1, we all would say that God originated everything, created everything, all right, all space, time, and matter, supernaturally. And that God created the immaterial universe and our world in incremental steps. I mean, look, it's not one day he does it in 6 days. Well, why? Because certain things have to be in place before the next thing can work. And he's laying a foundation that he builds on so that there are things to eat by the time there are animals to eat them. And so every one of us is a progressive creationist. The only question is how long does the progress take? How large are the steps? How long do those steps take? Third thing, God is actively involved in the creation of all life. God is not the result. Life is not the result of some process of blind forces of physics, natural selection. That's not what's happening. All of these views agree with each other in that God is actively involved. Also, God prepares everything in the universe as a home for the crown of His creation, mankind, which comes in last. All these views agree on that. We all also agree that humans are designed in some special way, described as being in God's image. And finally, God's relationship to His creation, we would say, is from that point on, is all even at that point, is all accurately described. We all agree about His relationship. Here's what's really interesting about that list I just showed you. Did you see how much of it also agrees with an atheistic worldview? It's the science, the atheistic science, in some ways, it parallels what we're talking about here. As an atheist, I would have said, look, I agree with some of these things. I can think of 4 things I would agree with. Here they are. Everything in the universe, all space, time, and matter, came into existence from nothing. I was a Big Bang cosmology, the standard cosmological model, which argues that everything comes into existence from nothing. I would have agreed with that. I would also have said, life on our planet appears in incremental steps. I thought it was evolutionary processes, but we both agree that life appears incrementally. Also, I would said, well, humans appear last, or pretty close to the end. We emerge later, not earlier. Well, that's what Scripture teaches. And I would have also said that somehow we're special. I would have argued it was our consciousness, but in the end, that's part of what puts us in the image of God. So I would have even agreed that in the special, unique nature of humans who came in last, who come on the planet last. So you see how so much of this, there's common ground. Now, what do you do with the differences? Well, here's what I would suggest to you. Every time I work a homicide, we theorize about how the murderer did it, because most of the time the murderers won't confess to us. They do occasionally, though. They will, but here's what we're looking at. We're looking at all the evidence and we're thinking, okay, I think it's Joe. Joe did it. Now, my partner will say, I think Joe did it this way. And my other partner will say, no, I think you're wrong. Joe did it this other way. And I'll say, I think you're both wrong. Joe did it this third way. Now, what we're looking for is we have explanations, and all these explanations would work in front of a jury. By the way, we won't even offer it to the jury because we don't want them to think that our explanation is necessarily true. We're speculating, okay? Based on the evidence, but we are still speculating because he hasn't confessed to it, and I don't have video. So I just have to speculate on how he actually did the crime. Here's what I can tell the jury. There's no alibi for this guy. There's nothing in the evidential set that eliminates my suspect from contention. This defendant not only is really made clear by the evidence, there's no evidence that eliminates him. Now, this is something very similar here. What I care about in my criminal trials is I've got enough evidence to demonstrate to the jury that he did it. I may never be able to explain how he did it. And by the way, they're going to convict him. They don't need to know how he did it. They want to just know, does the evidence point to him as the killer? If it does, they might disagree with each other about how he did it. All we need to know is there enough evidence to demonstrate that he did it? Yes. Same thing here. Is there enough evidence to demonstrate that God did it? Yes. Do you have a theory that's different than mine? Probably. We're all humans. We probably have little pet theories about what's different. Even those of us who say we're all young earth creationists will have some variances in our young earth creationism. Same is true for old earth creationism, I'm sure. My point is, we have these different theories about how he did it. Those are never as important as... Now, I can interview this guy later after maybe we convict him, if he decides he wants to do an interview, and I can ask him. And you know what always happens every single time? We have gotten it wrong. All 3 of us are wrong in some way. This guy will confess to it, and I'll think, oh my gosh, who would have guessed he would do it that way? But sure enough, he did it that 4th way. Well, something similar is going to happen, I think, when we finally get in front of God. When we offer what we believe was our proper interpretation of natural and special revelation, and he's going to say, yeah, you're close, but here's the twist. And we're going to go, wow, didn't see that coming. That's probably what's going to happen to us. This is not an essential in my view. What's more important is that he did it. And if we disagree about how he did it, let's stay brothers. Let's stay connected to the essentials and not divide over the non-essentials, and we'll go from there. I think both of us can agree on the primacy of Scripture. It's just a matter of what's it trying to tell us? You know, we don't believe that God has the wings of an eagle or the wings of a bird, but the Psalms say he does, because we know not to read that way. All of us are trying to interpret. I want to give some grace to my brothers who are trying to interpret. I also want to give my grace to brothers who say, hey, you know, the science may not be there that shows us what's really happening in the natural realm. Let's give grace to each other. And I hope that helps you to deal with this very contentious issue of the age of the universe.